When it comes to judging video game controllers, I feel there are two camps to go about it. One camp is judging it as a general controller, one that can be used across multiple systems. In that sense, I feel every modern controller is quite good. They all have the necessary buttons and features needed to play just about every modern game. Preference then only sets upon the smallest of differences. Xbox has the best overall production quality, feeling the most durable and tightly built. The DualSense has haptic triggers, which I do like as a small addition to enhance the immersion. And the symmetrical design greatly complements 2D games. The Switch Pro controller has my personal favorite form factor, which makes the controller fit really well in my hands. I like how quick it is to turn on and turn off the controller, while the other ones require holding the home buttons down for 10 tedious seconds. And the 40-hour battery on the Switch Pro is certainly appreciated after having to charge my DualSense 40 goddamn times for one playthrough. To keep things fair though, the Switch Pro has by far the worst rumble, and sure, haptic rumbling is cool and all, but the generic vibration rumble is weak and loud as shit, which gets legitimately annoying. Regardless though, each controller is perfectly viable to play any modern game you want, with only the smallest of insignificant features being potentially absent. There's also judging a game controller based on how well it complements the console it accompanies. Modern controllers are pretty boring in that sense, since like I said, each one is just fine and you can use them across their rivaling consoles and be able to play their games just fine. Your only obstacle then is keeping in mind the different button labels. Be sure to think twice when asked to press X. All well and good, but there's something special when a game controller is completely unique to the console and library of games it was created to play. It's one of the reasons why I find the N64, GameCube, and Wii libraries so varied. Their library of games aren't so easily revisited on new systems due to their games being tied to the original controllers used to play them. There's obvious aspects like the N64C buttons, the GameCube's clickable analog triggers, and the Wii's infrared sensor, which still controls a cursor better than what gyro can do today. There is one thing I do want to give special attention to. The one thing that truly makes me insistent on using the original controllers to play their games. The Octagonal Analog Stick Gate. Something that I've been thinking about recently is how Nintendo came up with and stuck with an octagonal gate for their analog sticks for so long. Sony would have the DualShock only a few years after the N64, and analog sticks today still mostly follow this template of a circular gate, a smooth rotation, and clickable sticks. The N64 stick is still so different in design that it's not really comparable to the other controllers. The GameCube and Wii's analog stick is far closer to what the DualShock accomplished, while still maintaining the key characteristics of the N64 analog stick. Those characteristics being the octagonal gate and distinctly bumpy rotation. It's something that I never see talked about, and how could it when it's so challenging to convey? You rotate a modern analog stick, and it's slick and smooth. The only resistance you feel comes from the pull back to the center where the stick rests. On N64, GameCube, and Wii, the rotation is far more rigid. You can feel resistance coming from not just the center, but the corners as well. You can feel when you've reached a corner without having to press the stick all the way. It's a physical characteristic that's absent on third-party replica-style controllers, and it's why I could never feel fully comfortable using them. I've tried to comprehend this characteristic, not so much how it works, but why it works. I say why because I've always had this underlying preference for these particular sticks. There's a build quality here that I unconsciously feel when I play games with them, and when I play games without them. The stiff and rigid rotation is important, but the octagonal gate is also important. I can only speculate, but I feel Nintendo, when designing their first analog stick, tried to make it as much of a natural evolution to the D-pad as possible, in the same way the D-pad was as much of a natural evolution to 8-way joysticks. This is where the utility of having an octagonal shape shines. The key advantage of an analog stick is having full 360-degree range of motion. While that may seem like an inarguable upgrade, so many games are still complemented best with a simple 8-directional input method. The D-pad will forever shine as the input method for 2D games, which is why it's still used today. Having an octagonal gate is such a brilliant way to keep an 8-directional reference on a 360-degree input type. You're not losing access to the full 360 range of motion, which some have claimed. It's just far easier to feel when you've reached one of the 8 cardinal directions. This may seem pointless, and for the sake of complete transparency, It is. There's a reason why modern controllers don't have this design anymore, and it's mostly because it really isn't that necessary. Regardless, I found legitimate utility with this design that makes me prefer it in a number of instances. Think about why Nintendo keeps bringing back the GameCube controller just for Super Smash Bros. It's such a strange phenomenon that an entire community shows extreme affinity for one specific controller for this particular series. There is the button layout. The GameCube has one of the more unique face button layouts that really does feel natural with Smash. But one aspect that I haven't seen mentioned is specifically regarding the Octagonal Gate. Smash is a 2D fighting game series that's mostly controlled with an analog stick. Playing 2D games with an analog stick is usually an uncomfortable control method, simply because the limited movement you see with a 2D game doesn't play well with the full range of motion you feel with an analog stick. Having an octagonal gate for Smash makes using an analog stick feel much more natural, as you can physically feel where each cardinal direction is. Performing all the directional specific moves as well feels more natural, since you can once again feel where the diagonals are. It comes together remarkably well, and I do believe it's a key component that makes the GameCube controller the top Smash Bros. Controller. I love going back to the old school Resident Evil games every now and then, and for the longest time I couldn't explain why I preferred playing the releases on GameCube. It then hit me that it's all because of the octagonal gate. I would play the PlayStation originals with the D-pad, and that still plays perfectly fine. It's still completely intuitive because the games only have 8 directional movement, so the D-pad works perfectly well here. But even still, I personally find using a D-pad in a 3D environment to be a tad uncomfortable. You all know what I'm talking about. It's why Mario 64 DS gets so much flack. The D-pad works best when I'm hopping my thumb across it, opposed to rotating my thumb around it. Using a smooth analog stick also feels a little weird with Resident Evil because there's only 8 directional movement, which still feels off with an analog stick. You can say I'm being extremely picky, which in all fairness, I absolutely am. But on GameCube, playing the Resident Evil games with an octagonal gate gives me the best of both worlds. I honestly can't even describe the comfort of playing with the fixed camera angles and tank controls with the GameCube's analog stick. I understand many people get disoriented, but I can't help but feel the octagonal gate made playing the classic Resident Evils feel a lot more natural to me despite the unorthodox controls. Even for something like Resident Evil 4, playing this game on new consoles always felt a little weird to me because the game still only has 8 directional movement. You can, in fact, still use the D-pad to move if you want. I really can't be the only one who feels this, but come on, it's a strange control when I'm moving the analog stick towards the corner with no visual control feedback until I've reached that 45 angle when the character finally starts to turn. With an octagonal gate, it feels much more natural and less distracting. See, this isn't a problem with Resident Evil 5 since that game does have proper analog directional control. But since Resident Evil 4 only has 8 directions, then yeah, this kind of thing does become more noticeable for me. It's gotten me thinking on how the utility of an octagonal gate could be used with games today. The Link's Awakening remake on Switch was rightfully criticized when the game for whatever reason only has 8 directional movement, without being able to use the D-pad as an alternative for the analog stick. If the Switch had an octagonal gate, then I'd like to imagine this wouldn't be much of an issue because the corners would make the 8 directional movement feel more comfortable. The 3D Mario games like Mario Galaxy and 3D World rely heavily on angular level design that mostly complements 8 directional movement. This was just fine on Wii with Galaxy because the nunchuck maintains the octagonal gate. I've always felt Galaxy on Switch felt a little weird to control because those angular level designs don't play well with a more circular analog stick. 3D World tried to circumvent this by having the controls themselves be more angular. Even with a circular analog stick, you can still see and feel the characters snap to the 8 cardinal directions, simply because it plays better with those angular level designs. I wonder if simply having an octagonal gate would be a better solution if it means the game could have more flexible controls for those more open areas. Metroid Prime is a weird example as it's another game that uses tank controls. Even with the new controls of the remastered version, a part of me still prefers the original tank controls simply because I feel the gameplay flows a little better compared to the twin stick controls. But a weird issue that I wasn't expecting is how the absence of the octagonal gate makes it genuinely hard to simply move straight. Using the classic controls, I couldn't help but swerve left and right when trying to move straight because of how sensitive the movement controls are. Something I never had an issue with in the GameCube release, all thanks to the octagonal gate. These are cherry-picked examples of incredibly specific use cases, But I don't know, I still can't help but think the Octagonal Gate could still have amazing utility even when it's not that apparent. I can only speculate from here, but I'd imagine even games with extremely precise and sensitive controls could potentially benefit from an Octagonal Gate. Simply being able to better grasp where the corners are, to feel where each 45 degree is, could be extremely helpful for games with sensitive controls. I could be dead wrong, as I'm only going off the library of these systems that use this specific analog stick design. By all stretch, I could simply be talking out of my ass, but regardless, preferring this type of analog stick was a constant when preferring playing the library of these systems with their respective original controllers. What do you think? This was a brief topic that's been clouding my head for a while, and I wanted to bring attention to it. I'd love to read about what you fellas think. Is the Octagonal Gate an underappreciated controller design? Or is it completely antiquated and not necessary anymore? In practice, it's not easy to really try it for modern games, as playing with a GameCube controller on Switch is really limited to Smash and Mario Sunshine. Sure, you can technically use the GameCube controller for every game, but the GameCube controller is missing just enough buttons to make most modern games unplayable with it. Modern adaptations of the GameCube controller wouldn't work as well in my opinion, because they're all missing that extremely distinctive stick resistance on these original sticks. Maybe Nintendo can revisit this particular stick design, as I still feel there's lots of potential to be tapped in here. I would like to take a moment to thank those for engaging with me on this silly little topic. Have any of you thought about this particular unimportant aspect in game design? If any of you have further examples of how an Octagonal Gate has benefited you, then please, I'd love to read about them. Or if you completely disagree, then I'd love to read why. After all this dumb shit is subjective, and I find no harm in indulging in such trivial manners. I'd like to do more of these smaller, lesser mentioned parts of the gaming experience before I take part in another longer styled video, so hopefully it won't be long before I have another out for you. Either way, I do believe that'll be all for me today, so I just want to say thank you for watching.